You're listening to How to Win Friends and Save the Republic, a podcast from the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. I'm your host, Andy Moore. My guest today is Chad Peace. This is actually Chad's second appearance on our podcast. We previously spoke with him in the episode entitled Hope for All Voters about his involvement in the independent voter movement and the implications that the rise of independent voters may have on our electoral systems. Today, we're going to be talking with Chad about More Choice San Diego, which is a really exciting new effort to reform elections in San Diego by bringing ranked choice voting to the town of San Diego. Chad's involved with the campaign through his affiliation with the Independent Voter Project, as are a number of other NANR members, including Business for America, independentvoting.org, Open Primaries, Represent Us, Take Back Our Republic, and Mr. John Palmer. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Just like old times. So this is a really exciting project that you guys have going there in your hometown of San Diego. Can you tell us a little bit about how it got started and how it came about?
Yeah, it's in my backyard, and as we all know, there's been the national conversation about ranked choice voting. For those who don't know, the organization I represent, I'm a legal advisor to the Independent Voter, authored California's top 2 nonpartisan primary, as well as San Diego's last major election reform, which was a measure called Measure K in 2016. I actually personally authored that, partnered with a local group called Alliance San Diego that does a lot of immigrant rights type work. They had a companion measure called Measure L that was written by them. And then we ran the campaign for Measures K and L, and both of them passed, in the mid 60s, having been told that we didn't have a chance when we got together. So to your question, how did this manifest is, I'm in San Diego, I'm in the circles, and you started just hearing people talking about, let's go get ranked choice voting passed in San Diego. Now, for Independent Voter Project, we actually have on our strategic plan to introduce what we call the advancement of top 2 primaries to a top 4 or top 5 system, right? And then you had other groups like Amy Tobias and Ed Chaplin from Represent Us locally. We're having conversations, and they're doing a lot. League of Women Voters was getting interested. And so I kind of just said, hey, let's all just get together in a room and talk about it. And if we're going to do something, let's do it together, right? We're all reform minded. We all want to do something together. Maybe right now we have a little bit of differences of opinion on the next path on the way to do it, but it would be felony stupid for us to go and have 4 or 5 different efforts floating around. So, we all got in a room and talked about different issues. Should we eliminate the primary? Should we keep the primary? Should we use traditional ranked choice voting? Should we introduce a Condorcet methodology for election wonks? A head-to-head methodology. And so it's actually not that new of an effort. I'd say our first conversation started about 2 years ago. Some of you may be aware that thing called COVID happened. So we had kind of gotten this campaign off the ground. And I think right after we had our first in-person event, the world shut down. But we didn't stop. We had a digital event where we actually delivered different types of beer to people's doors and had them rank them on the Zoom event. It was very successful. And what I can say is this kind of coalition, while we don't always agree on everything, I think that's the nature of a coalition. It's been phenomenal to work with. I know there's a lot of folks in the reform world that may be like, why are we seem to be each other's biggest adversaries? This coalition has been the opposite. Very focused on progress over perfection. And, we've expanded the coalition out. We include the immigrant rights groups, the refugee rights groups. We have, indivisible type groups. We have Take Back Our Republic, who is a more conservative organization. So the coalition's kind of grown at this grassroots level of organizations like the League of Women Voters, who focus on voters and voting rights. And in the last election cycle, where we obviously couldn't do signature gathering, this is a brand new issue for the San Diego Council. At the time, it was a 4-4, a 4 Democrat, 4 Republican, 1 independent council member. We came a single vote away from having them place it on the ballot last election in the form of a top 4 primary, similar to Alaska. So, some people call that a failure. I like to call it a enormous success. Frankly, we had hundreds of people calling into these council meetings. There was a lot of enthusiasm. We had I don't think any of us realistically thought that we were going to get it on the ballot in the middle of COVID. And, so that was a huge success. And to the coalition's credit, the first thing we did after that part was over is got together and said, what's our next steps? How do we continue the conversation? So those, the steering committee of the coalition has stayed together, meeting every couple of weeks, and we've invited folks that are technical advisors, that are involved in statewide election reform, national election reform, and said, okay, here, what are the trade-offs, and what's a system that's good for San Diego, right? San Diego has, even before statewide top 2 primaries, we've always had top 2 nonpartisan primaries at the municipal level, right? So, we don't want to do something that's out of conformance with the state or out of conformance with what voters are used to, but we want to introduce ranked choice voting in the general. And how do we align the incentives so that candidates that are the most representative win? And that's kind of where we're at today. We've landed at a consensus that we're going to change from a top 4 to a top 5, which a lot of you may be aware. There's organizations like IPI, Catherine Gell's organization, that is really pursuing a Final 5 strategy in other states. We've embraced the 5, and we're doing a traditional IRV approach. However, at least as it stands now, introducing what we're calling a consensus provision. And what the consensus provision says is that if there's a candidate that is preferred by the voters to every other candidate in the race, like I said, for your election wonks, Condorcet methodology, then that candidate should win. But doing it this way solves a lot of problems, including solves the issue of what happens if you have a Condorcet tie. Well, we have instant runoff voting. What happens if you can't implement it, or you can't, it's not certified by the Secretary of State? The Condorcet gets challenged legally because it is novel. Well, our answer is, it's severable from the rest of the initiative, right? If any of those factors come in, well, then we have a traditional top 5 IRV that's been sanctioned elsewhere. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We had just yesterday had a meeting with the local Democratic Party to say, hey, this is where we're at and where we want to go forward. Are you guys, can we reach a consensus with you? I'm a believer that small d democracy doesn't have to be in conflict with capital D Democratic Party. But can we get there? I don't know.
It's so interesting. I think just the path that you guys have taken is really illustrative for a lot of our listeners, a lot of members across the country that are interested in reform. One, it highlights that it is not an overnight thing, right? You said it started roughly 2 years ago, right? And that you have to have ongoing conversations. Rarely, I think, is, do you get 10 people in the room, you make a decision, and the next day action is started, right? It is often a evolutionary process to get to a consensus of what the policy looks like. What do you remember in those early conversations, Chad, kind of how this idea floated to the top? Were there other things that you explored and went down the road and decided to come back to this? Or was this from the beginning kind of an early lead in like, this is the right reform for us at this time?
Well, I think from the beginning, the first conversations, right, didn't include any of this, the head-to-head. So it was really focused on, there were groups in San Diego very focused and adamant that we can't eliminate the primary. And then there's those that said ranked choice voting at all cost, right? Let's, if we eliminate the primary, that's a talking point, right? To make cheaper elections and stuff. Well, after I think sincere and a genuine discussion, the coalition universally embraced, well, yeah, the downside of eliminating the primary is great. And I don't speak for everyone. I think there's those that would support it without the primary still, but the coalition unanimously I think has embraced that keeping the primary is better. And some ranked choice voting, I know there's folks that may disagree, but they say, well, why would you do that? Eliminate the primary, save money. There's lower turnout in the primary. Well, one of the concerns and the opposition to ranked choice voting uses is, well, what happens? You get elongated ballots and you get 26 candidates in the race, and then you create administrative nightmares. And then more importantly, how does the voter focus on candidates and their issues if there's 9, 10, 11 folks? So what we're saying, what we kind of came to was, look, one of the greatest advancements of the great progressive era was the introduction of the primary election system into the public, right? Because it gave the public for the first time an opportunity to frame who are the important and viable candidates that we can then consider in the general election. And we landed on originally 4 and now five as what we think. I think it's more common sense than scientific, as a comfortable number that, look, if you're a viable candidate and you demonstrated community support, you should be able to break into that top 5, right? You should be able to get into the top 5 and make it to the general election. And the benefits of that are, if it's limited to 5, is that now you also can't get marginalized, right? You may be a significant voice in the community and have all this grassroots support, not a lot of money. And in a 12 candidate field, well, the political organizations, the news media, the big money in politics, they're going to drown you, right? And so, the groups kind of had these arguments back and forth and landed on, well, we think it is important to keep the primary, and we think the incidental costs of keeping that spot on a ballot that's already gonna, you're not going to eliminate the primary election for everything else, so is to do it. But then we have introduced, okay, well, there is some value. Why would you have a primary if, say, only 3 candidates run? So the coalition at this point has said, well, if 5 or less candidates run, then we can skip the primary. You don't need to run it, right? But we do need to have that mechanism so that we don't end up with elongated ballots in fields. So I don't know if that was a long-winded answer to your question. That was the first primary conversation we had and why we landed there.
Yeah, no, I think that was a tremendous answer. And I know, one of maybe the last election that I voted in where I live, my ballot was 3 pages long, and that was for a general election. Like, everything was already should have been the shortest one, right? But you get state questions, you get other stuff that's on there, and it really can make for suddenly a ballot has become a term paper, right, for a lot of people, and that is intimidating to a lot of voters. And I think your point about ensuring that candidates have, to the extent we can, we try to equalize the ability for candidates to have a voice, to make a name for themselves, and to help voters, right, get to know all of them. I as you were speaking, the analogy that came to mind is a conversation my wife and I had last night about what we wanted for dinner. We decided we didn't want to cook, so we're going to get food from somewhere. Well, your immediate question is, what do you want? And if you think of every restaurant in town, and you were going to set about trying to rank them to pick the one that rises to the top, that's too many choices, right? It's overwhelming, and so you just say, I can't do it. Let's have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But if you can narrow that list down to 4 or 5 restaurants, and then say, okay, well, from these, which one do you like the best? That's a much easier, more palatable lift. And because primaries are already low turnout, I mean, we can't expect that suddenly everyone's going to shift around and even pay attention to that first notification. So I think by keeping the primary as you all are, I can see from my perspective where that makes a lot of sense.
Right. And it's interesting because the pushback we've gotten from the Democratic Party, and we've had very positive conversations and nothing negative to say. I think we are at 8-1 council now. I know I said 4-4-1 last election, just to highlight how San Diego changed for the rest of the folks. This is a traditionally more conservative Republican controlled town, and we went about 50-50. And then this last election, it's now 8-1 Democrat. So they're obviously a powerful and influential force in San Diego, and we would like to be working with them or not. But where they've stated their position is, where we have the difference isn't on any of those details. It's the issue of the primary. And what they've said is that they'll support if we utilize ranked choice voting in the primary and then only advance two. So the top two that make it in a ranked choice voting, and then use, it wouldn't really matter. It'd be a 2-person election in the general. Or do ranked choice voting in the general election, but eliminate the primary altogether. So that's kind of where we're at.
That's
and
interesting.
Hopefully we can bridge that divide.
Have you had conversations with the Republican Party there, even if they are the minority party?
We haven't yet. We've had significant conversations with Republican stakeholders, but we haven't engaged with the party or some of the organizations at a deeper level. They've indicated that they'd be happy to chat with us, but just the reality or the circumstance where San Diego is right now, it's that we need to get through this kind of first stage right now, and then take it to them. And I'll be the first to admit, I mean, I don't know how many people said for 2 years you're barking up a tree and, you can't get it passed. But they said that about Top 2. They said that about Measure K. And we have something special here in San Diego, that there's this base coalition that's not just interested in ranked choice voting. They're cerebral and have thought deeply about it. They understand it and understand, I think, what's driving the pushback, which maybe is not a pursuit of the same agenda that our coalition has. And it's not to talk bad about anybody, but it's the reality of it, right? And the coalition has embraced our initiative needs to be about voters, lowercase v voters, lowercase v democracy, right? And so insofar as our initiative may do something that compromises the ability of those voters to participate or to have a meaningful vote, our coalition has been against that.
Yeah. Well, and I think what you're getting at is the incentives for change are different for voters than they are for the established political parties, right? And what I think this effort is aiming to do is to make elections work better for voters rather than just the
Right.
parties.
Well, I mean, to that point, right? I think they can be misaligned incentives, but the point I've made, and maybe I'm crazy, is that it doesn't have to be a misalignment of incentives. Is that what's good for whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? I believe should be the same thing that's very good for voters. And in fact, I think I made this discussion here because they were talking about, the extreme vitriol and some of the heightened animation that's happening at things like school board meetings. They said, well, the pathway to expression is the ballot box. And we have in San Diego where you only have 2 Democrats on the general election ballot right now in many races. And you say, well, are you going to give voters, the only pathway to expression is to show up at a meeting and yell and scream and do that? Or are you going to give them an opportunity to cast a ballot and then influence the outcome by having second and third choices on the general election ballot, right? And then also is saying, well, the party itself having a system that allows more choices and allows more competition and stuff on the general ballot, and this can be a disagreement of the best way to advance the party. But I would argue that there's an alignment of incentives if the party sees the self-interest in allowing more diverse thought within their own party and the ability to represent more of those voices who are registering as independent voters or more distrusting of the party as it is today, and say, well, I think San Diego is going to be a Democratic city whether we pass this reform or we don't. And the question for the party is, do they want to represent the city because, you know, the Democrats are going to win and those are going to be your choices in the general election? Or is it going to be because we're going to have candidates that understand we can represent the broadest range of ideas in San Diego? And, you know, that's where we're at.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after a word from some of our sponsors. If you're interested in learning how to win friends and save the Republic, then you should know about Reformers Unite, a new virtual networking event hosted by NANNER, the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. Each month, NANNER sets aside a couple of hours solely dedicated to helping our members share updates about their organizations and to build deeper connections between NANNER members throughout the country. Reformers Unite happens on Fridays and is only available to NANNER members. So get on over to nonpartisanreformers.org and become a member today. Are you tired of the politics of division and deadlock? Do you want to do something about it, but you don't know where to start? CitizenConnect.us is your way to learn about and engage with over 400 organizations who are dedicated to helping Americans right, left, and center work together to heal our democracy. Find the organization or event that speaks to you and help us get back to making our great nation work, because it only works when we work together. Learn more at CitizenConnect.us. All right, and now back to the show. You know, one of the things that drives me absolutely batty about partisan politics is how whichever party is in the majority or has, particularly if it's a strong majority, their incentive, their desire to even see change, like, evaporates so quickly. But the moment that it flips, suddenly they're your best friend. And, you know, we've seen this play out in Virginia with redistricting and how difficult the path was to get that passed there. And we are certainly seeing, I guess, with redistricting across the country in red states and blue, right? And how the parties in power are trying to cling on to whatever sense of control or power they have. And from a party's perspective, that makes a lot of sense. But as we've often discussed on this show, and certainly at NANNER, you know, being voters first, right? Putting the focus on what is best for small d democracy, what is best for small v voters, as you said, is the path. That's the key to ensuring that our American democracy remains free and fair and representative in the way that most of us, I think, expect it to be. And so sometimes that means doing the thing that's good for democracy that might not be in the, I would say, selfish interest of a party at a given time.
No, I say I agree with that, and I think part of it is, you know, we have conversations about voting rights and voters, and then, you know, even gerrymandering and that stuff, where we view that through the lens, and the media talks about it through the lens of, well, will this help the Republicans or will this help the Democrats, right? Well, if we believe that the fundamental building block of democracy is voters, and the parties are built on top of the voters rather than the parties being the building blocks, and then the voters get to figure out which block they want to join, then you have to take a step back and say, forget whether this is good or bad for the parties, right? Is this good for the voters? And then the parties aren't going to go away because you did something good for the voters, but you should make it align the incentives so that voters get to participate and the parties have to be responsive to the voters rather than the other way around. And I think 99% of the conversations in this country are about the party blocks and who wins in the party conversation, and very rarely about who wins at the individual voter level.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And again, I mean, I think, you know, we recognize, as all of our members have kind of said, we are not anti-party, we're pro-voter. And there are ways, right, to change the incentives that realign system structures around our elections and around our democracy that are in support of voters that are pro-voter or voter first, whatever terminology you want to use. And that doesn't do anything to exclude the role of parties, right? And ideally, it allows for, as you said, parties to exist or even start up in the service of voters for the purpose of bringing like-minded people together and finding consensus there, rather than just trying to notch another win in their belt.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was just say, as a representative of the Independent Voter Project, I face that attack a lot. There's the assumption that because I'm part of the Independent Voter Project, that somehow we're anti-party or we're against the party. And I say nothing can be further from the truth. In fact, if you take the reforms and look at what we've done to its logical extension, we believe that we're helping strengthen the parties by forcing accountability across more voters. And that the worst thing for the parties is to continue to narrow themselves to a point where there's really relatively few voters who actually are lockstep with the party itself.
Well, Chad, what's next on the agenda? What's the next step that More Choice San Diego has to get through?
So you're looking here to finalize drafting and get filed relatively soon, because you have a long signature gathering period and everything gearing up for 2022. We will be announcing a fundraising drive here shortly, sending some stuff out publicly next week to start raising some campaign funds. We're having some significant stakeholder meetings. Like you said, we're still in conversations. We're hoping we do this in partnership with the local party. We'll see if that can manifest or not. But as it relates to our local coalition and then the statewide and national supporters who have been tremendously helpful and supportive to date, it's all right. Goes back to your question we were talking about earlier, is you got to raise the money to be able to do this, right? We want to wave a perfect wand. And in San Diego, you got to raise like 125,000 signatures, right? Just to get placed on the ballot, assuming council's, not going to put it on themselves. So that costs a lot of money. And, there are folks like Amy Tobias and Lori Thiel from League of Women Voters and Ed Chaplin. There's a number more I can name, have put in hundreds of hours out of just because they're dedicated to this reform movement. And now's the time to say, hey, we got to raise some significant financial resources. I don't want to pretend like we haven't gotten some financial. We wouldn't have gotten this far, but now's the time we got to raise significant financial resources to make it happen. And will we be able to? Nobody knows that, but I think if there's if an opportunity had ever come where you kind of had this crazy alignment of agreement among stakeholders at the statewide, national, local level who have kind of put aside, here's this perfect system that I'm demanding, you do, and say, you know what, we're all comfortable with this, and this is definitely a huge advancement on where you're at right now. This is it. And so, I don't speak for what's going on everywhere else across the country, but at least in San Diego and California, it's like this opportunity is almost too good to be true. And hopefully we can raise the funds to capitalize on it.
Yeah, that's right. Chad, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
My guest today has been Chad Peace with the Independent Voter Project. We've been discussing More Choice San Diego, and you can read more about the organization and get involved at morechoicesd.org. Thanks for listening to How to Win Friends and Save the Republic. This podcast is a program of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. For more information about our organization and how you can join, please visit our website at nonpartisanreformers.org.
This podcast is brought to you by IVN.us, an open news platform for independent-minded authors and readers. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe to IVN.us where you listen to podcasts. On SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, Acast, or iHeartRadio.
Hey there, How to Win Friends listeners. It's Jillian Youngblood from The Purple Principle. Ever wonder how our country got so polarized?
The rise of television news, the rise of social media, every single force is pushing us apart.
How do we become less polarized?
And this is a controversial one, is try to unblock people.
And can independent-minded Americans bridge the divide?
I think that there's value to having folks like me outside of the parties.
Pull back the curtain on partisanship with The Purple Principle, wherever you listen to podcasts.